Jessica Sacco's mom, Susan Tainer, sat in the front row of the courtroom with her daughter's ashes in her lap and waited to hear the sentencing for her daughter's murderer. It was an emotional atmosphere as Matthew Puccio gave one last plea to the judge.
I'm sorry, I can't really bring her back or take back the pain, but I am sorry.
Puccio stabbed Sacco at their Urbana apartment back in May. He then convinced 4 other people to help him get rid of her body.
For days, a 21-year-old woman in Urbana, Ohio stopped answering her phone, and at first, that silence may have sounded like the kind of thing people try to explain away, because maybe she was upset, maybe she wanted space, maybe she would call back later. But when her mother finally went to the apartment on West Light Street, there was one thing inside that refused to fit any ordinary explanation, and that was the locked bathroom door. By the next morning, the landlord, Gary Zirkle, stood there with that same uneasy feeling pressing on him, and instead of walking away from it, he started taking the door apart piece by piece, unscrewing the knob, trying to see inside, finding only the shower curtain at first, and then forcing the door open just enough to look beyond it. The moment he pulled that curtain back, the truth inside that bathroom ended whatever hope was left that this was just a missing person mystery, because behind it were the remains of Jessica Ray Sacco, a young woman whose final hours were far worse than anyone outside that apartment could have imagined. But what made Jessica's case so disturbing was not only the brutality of what was done after she died, but the fact that she did not die right away, and that changes everything. She survived the first attack. She was still alive, while other people remained close enough to hear, close enough to know, close enough to do something that might have saved her. And yet no one called for help. By the time police understood what had happened inside that apartment on West Light Street, the case was no longer just about one killer, but 5 killers, a body, and a shattered family and community. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Jessica Ray Sacco was born on August 28, 1990 in Santa Clara, California, and long before her name became tied to one of the most disturbing crimes in Urbana, Ohio. Her parents separated while she was still young, so childhood did not unfold in one steady home or one simple routine, and she spent part of those early years around her father's side of the family, close to her grandparents and tied to the kind of family connection that made a person feel anchored even when other things were shifting. As she got older, she moved to Urbana, Ohio, and that small town became the setting for her teenage years. She attended Graham High School, and later she briefly enrolled at Urbana University, so she stood in that same uncertain space where so many young people find themselves. Jessica was petite, bright, and full of personality. She smiled easily. She carried a playful energy around her, and she had the kind of goofy sense of humor that made her stand out. Life was not smooth, though. Jessica dealt with emotional struggles that made her world harder to manage than it may have looked from the outside, and some later accounts placed depression and bipolar disorder in that background. But those struggles did not define her, but they did shape the years when she was trying to hold herself together, and during her late teens, her relationship with her mother, Susan "Sue" Tainer, became strained. They were not always close, so Jessica looked for connection elsewhere, and much of that happened online. Then, by early 2011, Jessica made the kind of decision a lot of people make when they are young and hoping love will give their life direction. She moved to Florida to live with a boyfriend, and for a while, that must have looked like a fresh start, a chance to leave uncertainty behind and build something real with someone. But the relationship fell apart within about a year, and once it did, Jessica found herself back in a familiar place emotionally. That was when her mother stepped in again. Sue urged her to return to Ohio, and Jessica did. In mid-2011, with her mother's help, she got a small duplex apartment at 625 West Light Street in Urbana, and that little place became her chance to begin again. Mother and daughter started repairing the relationship that had been damaged over time, and the picture there was not of a woman reaching the end of herself. It was the picture of a young woman trying one more time to build a stable life. She had her own place. She had family support again. She was looking for work. She was trying to steady herself. She moved through online spaces where identity felt more open and belonging came faster, including the Juggalo world, a subculture built around the music of Insane Clown Posse and the idea of finding family among people who felt misunderstood or pushed aside everywhere else. So, for someone like Jessica, who wanted connection and wanted to feel understood, it made sense that she felt comfortable there. And it was through that same online world that Matthew Puccio entered her life. But Matthew did not come into the story as a man with any real stability behind him. He came in carrying the kind of background that already suggested disorder, anger, and drift long before he ever reached Urbana. He was from California, and much of his early life seems to have been spent without anything that looked steady for very long. He said he had been raised largely by his grandparents in Woodland, California, and that he attended private Christian schools. So on the surface, there may have been moments in his childhood that looked structured, but whatever order existed there did not hold for long. Even his later account of his own life sounded restless and violent, as if conflict had followed him from one stage to the next and had become part of the way he understood himself. As a teenager, Matthew tried living with his biological father in Southern California, but that did not turn into a stable home either. It ended in physical conflict and estrangement. So he drifted through state-run group homes and unstable living situations, carrying his anger with him and running into trouble again and again. The exact juvenile records were sealed, but the outline still came through clearly enough. He got into fights. He had repeated run-ins with authority. He later spoke about incidents that included violent altercations with other people and at least one confrontation with police. So even before he was legally an adult, the pattern was already there. He met conflict with aggression, and he moved through life without learning how to contain it. Then he became an adult, and instead of settling down, he kept drifting. He moved from state to state. He went through Virginia, then Utah, then Montana, and then Texas, never holding steady work for long, never staying in one place for more than a short stretch. By the time he was in Texas, he had children there, but even that part of his life seemed wrapped in instability. By 2011, he was unemployed, coming out of a failed engagement, and dealing with a custody dispute. So when he appeared in Jessica's life, he was not arriving from some hard season he had already survived. He was arriving in the middle of ongoing chaos. And the important thing about men like that is that they often know how to present the chaos in a way that sounds sympathetic at first. And for a young woman like Jessica, who understood loneliness and knew what it felt like to want somebody to choose you, that kind of story could have sounded familiar and even touching. So when the two of them connected online, the bond formed quickly. And after months of talking online, Matthew traveled from Texas to Ohio to meet Jessica in person. And once that happened, everything accelerated. The distance between them collapsed quickly. The online attachment became a real relationship, and the real relationship became a living arrangement. And by the fall of 2011, he had moved into Jessica's small duplex on West Light Street. That was the turning point, because once he crossed into her physical life, the dynamic changed from emotional closeness to shared space, shared routine, and daily influence. He was no longer just a voice on the screen. He was now inside her home. But Sue Tainter saw the shift almost immediately. There were signs that someone else was staying in Jessica's apartment, and once she realized it was Matthew, she confronted her daughter about it. Jessica admitted he was living there, and that forced the next step, because Sue wanted to meet him for herself. That meeting should have eased her mind if the relationship was healthy, but it did the opposite. From the first encounter, something about Matthew bothered her. He kept avoiding eye contact, and he carried himself in a way that made her feel he was hiding something. It was not just normal parental caution. It was instinct. It was the kind of reaction a person has when someone in front of them feels wrong in a way they cannot yet fully explain.
There were some clues that someone else was living there, and I finally confronted her, and she said, yes, Matthew is living with me. I said, okay, well, I'm going to go meet him. So we went and we met, and it didn't go very well.
Matthew was the kind of person who took up space quickly, and not just physical space. The neighbors next door felt that shift from the outside. Aaron Gall, who lived close enough to hear what was happening through the walls, did not like Matthew. He came across as rude and off-putting, the kind of man who made people uneasy before they even had a full reason for it. And after Christmas, the arguments between Matthew and Jessica started becoming more frequent. By the end of 2011, Jessica's apartment had stopped feeling like a fresh start and had started feeling crowded, tense, and unstable. The duplex on West Light Street was small to begin with. It had only one bedroom, so even two people living there would have felt cramped after a while. But Jessica, who was only 21, was no longer just sharing that space with Matthew Puccio, who was 25. By November 2011, Andrew Forney, 26, and his wife Candace Forney, 25, were living there too. That was no longer a boyfriend staying over too often or friends dropping by. They were in the apartment, sleeping there, and becoming part of everyday life inside Jessica's home. And now the space was starting to revolve around Matthew and the people connected to him. Then the circle widened again. Christopher Wright, who was 37, and Sharon Cook, who early reports identified as 25, became tied to the group around the apartment too, and once that happened, the place felt less like a home and more like a pressure point. At that stage, this was no longer just a troubled young couple living together. There was less privacy, less breathing room, and less chance for Jessica to step away when tension started building. The apartment became overcrowded, dirty, chaotic, and loud. The group leaned toward Matthew, not Jessica, and they talked around her, about her, and treated her more like a problem than the person whose apartment it actually was. Then, in February 2012, another sign of how unsafe the apartment had become appeared. A 14-year-old girl from Texas stayed there for about a week, and police got involved. Matthew was charged with custody interference for harboring a minor. That incident mattered because it showed that even before Jessica was killed, serious trouble was already happening under her roof. The apartment she had taken to restart her life was now a place where police were already being drawn in because of the man she had let move in. By early 2012, the situation inside Jessica's apartment had become much worse, and the change was showing in ways the people around her could see. One of Jessica's friends noticed her posting disturbing things on Facebook around that time, and that immediately raised concern because it suggested Jessica may have stopped taking the medication that had once helped keep her steady. Then the reason behind that started coming into view. Later accounts said Matthew had pushed her to stop taking it. In his view, she did not need it. And that mattered because once that influence took hold, the situation inside the apartment started getting uglier fast.
He basically told me she will not be taking her medication because I don't believe in medication and she doesn't need medication. And that's really where things got really ugly.
And yet, Matthew's friends did not make things easier for her. They disrespected her in her own home. They would even sit in the same room sending Matthew nasty messages about Jessica while she was there, mocking her indirectly and feeding his irritation with her. So the pressure on Jessica was coming from every direction at once. She was outnumbered, and the apartment no longer felt like a place where she could relax or feel safe. One friend, Amanda, told her directly that she needed to get Matthew out of there, and by then, that advice matched what Jessica herself seems to have been feeling. She had reached the point where something had to change. By March 2012, Jessica appears to have been at a breaking point. She even asked her mother if she could move back home for a while, which shows how bad things had become inside that apartment. And at the same time, there were signs she was also thinking about taking back control of the place instead of simply leaving it behind. By mid-March, she was confiding to friends that she might ask Matthew to leave, and that helps explain why the final confrontation may have happened when it did. If Matthew sensed that Jessica was pulling away, or worse, that she was about to force him out, then trouble is just at the corner. Then came the issue of the text messages. Later, Matthew claimed that he found messages on Jessica's phone that upset him, and he said she had texted someone that she wanted him dead. But people close to Jessica doubted that story. To them, it sounded less like the truth and more like something Matthew used afterward to justify what he did. And while all of this was happening, Jessica's family still did not know how close things were to disaster. Her mother was trying to reach her by phone that week and was getting no answer. At one point, she went by the apartment to check on her, and Matthew answered the door and told her Jessica was not there, saying she was staying with a friend. Looking back, that moment feels chilling, because while Jessica's family was still trying to make sense of her silence, she may already have been in terrible danger inside the very apartment where she was supposed to be safe. So the violence on March 22nd did not come out of nowhere. It came at the end of weeks of conflict, humiliation, resentment, and control. Jessica wanted space back. She wanted relief. She may have wanted Matthew out. and by the time that argument began, the apartment had already become the kind of place where one final spark was enough to set everything off. On the morning of March 22, 2012, the tension inside Jessica Sacco's apartment finally turned into violence. During that fight, Matthew Puccio stabbed Jessica once in the abdomen. But the stabbing did not end Jessica's life, and that is where the whole case changed. The wound was serious, but it did not hit vital organs, and the coroner later said it likely caused only limited bleeding. Jessica was still alive after that first attack, so the story did not become only about a man who turned violent. It became about what happened in the time that followed, and about who knew enough to act and still did nothing. Candace Forney was aware of the stabbing, and the others were still there in the apartment. The four friends were in the living room while Jessica was injured in another room with Matthew, and whether they were sitting silently, listening, waiting, or trying not to involve themselves, the outcome was the same. No one called 911. No one called for an ambulance. No one tried to get Jessica to a hospital. Then Matthew Puccio suffocated her by placing a plastic bag over her head, and it is supported by the appellate record and by the coroner's finding that she died of suffocation, not from the stab wound. But Jessica fought hard. Prosecutors later said Matthew first tried to suffocate her with one plastic bag and that she tore through it and scratched him, so he used a second bag and forced it over her face until she died. However, Matthew later claimed Jessica wanted to die, and he tried to present the killing as something like mercy, consent, or emotional collapse. But that narrative came from him, and it came after he had already shown a pattern of changing his story. Once Jessica died, the case moved into a stage that felt almost impossible to process. After her death, Matthew Puccio, Andrew Forney, and Christopher Wright her body in the bathroom of the residence. And what had already been a murder scene became the hidden room where the group tried to turn a killing into a disposal problem. Body parts were placed into plastic bags, and the handling of Jessica's remains stretched over a longer period than a rushed attempt to flee. And this process took about 2 days, and it also established that Candace Forney entered the bathroom during that period. According to prosecutors, the 5 of them took a break in the middle of it, went to Speedway and McDonald's, and then came back. Then the cover-up widened beyond the apartment. The Forneys' vehicle, a green minivan, was used to transport Matthew Puccio and Jessica's body parts, which had been placed in plastic bags. The remains were taken to Christopher Wright's home in Hamilton, Ohio, and that after they got there, Puccio spent the night inside Wright's house while Andrew and Candace Forney slept in their van with the body parts still with them. From there, some of Jessica's remains were discarded in southern Ohio and northern Kentucky. Early reporting mentioned Cincinnati, southwest Ohio, and Kentucky. After March 22, 2012, Jessica's mother stopped hearing from her in the way she normally would have. And at first, that silence may have seemed like something temporary, because people miss calls, people stay out, people pull away for a day or two, and families often try to explain silence before they allow themselves to fear it. But the days kept passing and the calls kept going unanswered. At some point during that week, she went to the apartment herself, because that is what people do when the phone stops being enough. Matthew answered the door and told her Jessica was staying with a friend. He gave her something that sounded like an answer, but not one that brought any real relief. It only delayed the truth, so she kept checking. She kept carrying that feeling that something was wrong. Then, on Thursday, March 29, 2012, she went back to the duplex on Westlight Street, and this time the silence inside the apartment felt harder to ignore. Next door lived Gary Zirkle, the landlord, and he could see that Jessica's mother was worried. Then came Friday, March 30th, 2012, and that was the day everything changed. Gary Zirkle lived right next door to the duplex, so he did not have far to go. He approached that locked bathroom door carrying the same uneasy feeling Jessica's mother had left him with the night before, and instead of ignoring it, he acted on it. He began by removing the screws from the doorknob so he could see inside. Through that small opening, all he could make out at first was the shower curtain, so he forced the door further open and looked beyond the curtain. Then, he pulled it back, and the moment he did, the last possible space for denial disappeared. Behind that curtain, in the bathtub area, were Jessica Sacco's remains, and that was the moment Jessica stopped being a missing daughter who had not called home and became the victim at the center of a murder investigation. Police responded to the apartment, and once they entered that duplex, the case widened almost immediately. The bathroom had become the hidden center of what happened. But investigators did not take long to realize the truth reached beyond that room. Crime scene processing began. The apartment was secured. The remains in the bathtub area made it clear that this was not a single burst of violence followed by a failed attempt to hide it. It was a chain of choices involving multiple people, multiple locations, and multiple stages of concealment. Very quickly, 5 names came into focus: Matthew Puccio, Andrew Forney, Candace Forney, Christopher Wright, and Sharon Cook. By the time the first wave of charges came down, all 5 had been apprehended. Matthew Puccio faced the central murder charge and had his bond set at $100,000, while the others were jailed on $50,000 bonds. Even after the arrests, even after Jessica's body had been found, and even after 5 people were in custody, Matthew Puccio still tried to control the story.
So many families go without, and we are just very, very lucky.
When Matthew spoke, Jessica's mom wept softly, holding what remained of her daughter. After sentencing, she told reporters she believed he was an expert in knowing how to manipulate people. He had tried multiple stories to escape blame, from claiming insanity to blaming Jessica herself.
Matthew was more into emotional cruelty. He liked to emotionally control people, spiritually control them. He gets off on emotionally imprisoning you. He looks for the weakness and he takes it from you. He controls you. He looked and found Jessica, a young girl with very low self-esteem, bipolar, on medicine. He knew he could control her mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. And he knew from the moment he woke up that morning, he was going to find a victim.
In the days after the killing, and then again in a jailhouse interview with the Dayton Daily News in early April 2012, he did not speak like a man simply admitting what he had done and leaving the facts alone. He spoke like someone trying to reshape the final hours of Jessica Sacco's life into something softer, something more mutual, and something that would leave him looking less like a killer and more like a damaged man caught inside a tragedy. He said Jessica still loved him. He said she apologized. He said she asked for a last kiss. He said she wanted to die. He said she told him to let her die already. He said she had stabbed herself, or that she had pulled his wrist into the knife, and he said text messages on her phone had shown she wanted him dead. Then he added more layers to the story, talking about threatening messages, fear, and even witchcraft, as though the real problem inside that apartment had been the danger he thought he was facing rather than the danger Jessica was trapped in. By the time he was done, he had tried to cast himself in 2 roles at once, as both the victim of a chaotic situation and the tragic participant in a death he wanted people to see as something complicated, emotional, and misunderstood. But the evidence did not move with his story, and neither did the people who had seen Jessica during those final days. The medical findings still pointed in the same direction. Jessica had been stabbed, but the stab wound did not kill her. She died later of suffocation. The legal record still held. Kristen Schultz pushed against Matthew's version too, and she did it with one detail that made the whole story even sadder. She had seen Jessica the day before the killing, and what stayed with her was not someone who seemed resigned to dying. It was the opposite. Jessica had looked a little happier. She looked lighter. Schultz said it looked like she was getting her old self back. That mattered because it stripped away the emotional script Matthew tried to write after the fact. As the case moved deeper into 2012, the legal process began sorting out what each person had done and what each person would answer for. Matthew Puccio at first drifted toward an insanity and competency route, and for a time that looked like one more attempt to shift the ground under the case, but that path did not carry him where he needed it to. The official convictions tied to him included aggravated murder and related counts. On August 20th, 2012, Matthew Puccio received the heaviest sentence in the case, a life sentence with parole eligibility only after about 42 years.
I just walked out of the Champaign County Common Pleas Court here in Urbana. I can tell you that Matthew Puccio was sentenced to 42 years to life in prison with a chance of parole only after 42 years. He was one of the 4 co-defendants sentenced today in the murder of Jessica Sacco. Now, if you may remember, that murder took place back in March right here in Urbana, where we're told that Puccio actually not only killed Sacco, but then later dismembered the body. He was sentenced along with 3 other people today. Christopher Wright got 4 years, Andrew Forney got 10 years, and Sharon Cook, another co-defendant, got 3 years. Another person, Candace Forney, is actually going to be sentenced tomorrow morning. Now, we just got finished talking with the victim's mother. She tells us she's very happy with the sentence. In fact, she was dancing in court. She brought with her the ashes of her daughter to be able to see what had happened today. She said her daughter's birthday would have been a week from Tuesday. She's very happy again with the sentence. One more time, Matthew Puccio sentenced to life in prison with a chance of parole only after 42 years. Reporting live in Urbana, Jordan Burgess, 2 News.
Then the court turned to the others. Candace Forney received 6 years in prison, and the van used to transport Jessica's body parts was forfeited. Later, she appealed, and the appeal failed. Andrew Forney received around 10 years because his role placed him closer to the physical handling of the body and deeper into the cover-up. Christopher Wright received around 4 years, and Sharon Cook received around 3.
Jessica Sacco's mom, Susan Tainer, sat in the front row of the courtroom with her daughter's ashes in her lap and waited to hear the sentencing for her daughter's murderer. It was an emotional atmosphere as Matthew Puccio gave one last plea to the judge.
I'm sorry, I can't really bring her back or take back the pain. I am sorry.
Puccio stabbed Sacco at their Urbana apartment back in May. He then convinced 4 other people to help him get rid of her body.
Not only did I victimize her friends and her family, but I victimized my own friend Andrew. I victimized his wife and the other 2 involved as well as his friends and family. And as much as it pains me to say it, I even victimized my own kids.
Inside the Champaign County Courthouse, Jessica's mom told reporters she was pleased with today's sentencing. She also began to tear up as she remembered those most intimate moments she had with her daughter.
Personality-wise, just fun. She didn't hate anybody. She always saw the good in people.
She wanted others to share her joy for finally getting justice for her daughter.
Does give a sense of closure. So many families, unfortunately, do not get this justice. So many families go without. And we are just very, very lucky.
In Urbana, I'm Annette Pegler reporting.
4 other people were there when Jessica Sacco was murdered and dismembered. They were all convicted of lesser charges for helping hide the body parts and then not reporting the crime. This morning, Christopher Wright was sentenced to 4 years in prison and fined $500. Sharon Cook was sentenced to 3 years and a $500 fine. Andrew Forney was sentenced today to 10 years in prison and fined $500 as well. The 5th suspect, Candace Forney, is scheduled to be sentenced tomorrow.
And after the courtrooms emptied, cleanup crews went into the apartment in protective gear. The place had to be emptied. The landlord said he planned to gut the bathroom. Most of Jessica's belongings were discarded because the scene had been contaminated, and the home she had once taken as a chance to restart her life had to be stripped back almost completely. But in the middle of all that destruction, a few personal things were saved. Her birth certificate was kept, her baby book was kept, those small items were returned to her mother. Then, in October 2013, Puccio was sentenced again in a separate case involving the 14-year-old runaway girl who had stayed at Jessica's apartment weeks before the murder. He pleaded guilty to unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, and the court gave him an additional 3 years to be served consecutively.
But first, a man already behind bars for dismembering his girlfriend receives more prison time.
Today, Matthew Puccio learned his sentence for child sex crimes. Rob Sneed was in court along with the girlfriend's mother as the judge handed down the punishment.
No family member showed up to support Puccio during his latest sentencing for having sex with a teenage runaway. But Jessica Sacco's mother was there. She wanted to see the man who murdered her daughter get more prison time. She found it difficult to hold back emotions.
I hope the prison shows you the same mercy you showed your victims. Because he shows no mercy. So I hope the prison shows him the same as what he showed my daughter.
A tearful message from Susan Tanner to the man who killed and dismembered her daughter, Jessica Sacco, last year. She was right there as 27-year-old Matthew Puccio faced a Champaign County judge again, this time for having sex with a 14-year-old runaway.
You know, you feel for the families that he's victimized. You know, they couldn't be here, and I wanted to be here to represent.
Tanner's disgust was clear as Puccio tried to convince the judge he had changed for the better.
What I'm doing is a group session for stress inoculation, is to help learn healthy ways to deal with stress.
But the prosecutor told the judge Puccio was dangerous and believed he would harm someone else if given the chance. And after hearing Puccio again, Tanner couldn't agree more.
Because nothing comes out of his mouth that's the truth. He's a pathological liar. He's an individual who seeks violence. He seeks out victims. He's a true predator.
The judge's sentence was swift.
Count one, the court imposes 3 years to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction.
And the judge also ordered Puccio to pay back court costs, and he must register as a Tier 2 sex offender if he gets out of prison. He won't be eligible for parole for 45 years. Reporting in the Springfield newsroom, Rob Sneed, 2 News, working for you.
And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.